Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 36B2, Melting Minds Molds, the New Clear Option, on reshaping thinking, learning, knowing, and believing forever. This is the fourth of a thread in our study of the understanding how knowledge itself works. We started with the very questions of reality and how we can know anything. We explored the fight between competing approaches to addressing these fundamental questions, and we saw what progress was made or attempted in this direction. We now come to the turning point in this story. A radical pivot, a watershed. But first, let's meet our fictional friends again.
It's a warm, sunny afternoon. Steve, Brian, Brenda, and Irene are relaxing in the garden, the beers flowing. Bruno the dog and Iris the cat are pottering about, doing doggy and catty things. Brian wonders aloud, "You know what's funny? When I throw a stick, Bruno immediately runs and fetches it, but Iris would never." Brenda is like, "Yeah, dogs are good animals." Irene, not to be outdone, immediately retorts, hold on, cats are even better. They have cat priorities rather than, catering to human ones." Steve seconding Irene, "Yeah man, cats know how to go about things." "Sss, Ash here. Haven't you read episode 11 yet?" Brian sits up. "Look, all I'm saying is dogs, like our Bruno, are orderly. You know what to expect from them." Irene butts in. "Well, if you're trying to Iris and her ilk on those grounds, the problem is with you. You don't know what to expect because you don't know how to expect how cats will behave." Brenda now pips in. "Well, it's not like you can get to Iris to do predictable things either. As for Bruno, one day in the future someone will no doubt decisively demonstrate you can predict its actions. Like to take just one example, you ring a bell and the dog will start salivating for food, something like that." Brian adding, "Yeah, but with cats, it rings no bells." So the heated debate goes on. The cows have not come home yet. Well, they don't even have cows. The beer's still flowing, and Bruno and Iris are Brunoing and Irising about, seemingly oblivious to all the squabble. Because neither the Brunoists nor the Irisians are willing to give up, each one of them pointing out to the perceived strengths of their pet and the deficiencies of the other. Eventually, they decide, well, okay, this is enough. Or maybe they ran out of beer. And one of them proposes, "Look, how about this? We should agree that it is possible to observe and then predict the behavior of dogs. And in the same token, it is not possible to observe and then predict the behavior of cats." Like Bruno conforms to a sort of natural order, whilst Iris is in the realm of the inexplicable, sort of beyond natural laws. Everyone's happy. The sun's starting to go down. It's time to head in for dinner. You can almost see Bruno and Iris winking at you as the curtains close.
The edifying edifice of reality.
Act 2. The Real World. Enter William of Ockham. Last time we met Roger Bacon, going back to the 1200s in scholastic Europe, who we saw was more ambitious than reality allowed for. We shall now see how, in a twisted sense, Ockham saved Roger's Bacon. And in doing so, one might say, upended a system with foundations going back about 1600 years. William of Ockham came in only slightly later than his fellow Englishman plus fellow Oxforder, and into the same medieval Europe, infused in piety and the desperate need to explain, elaborate on, and even justify it. Over the last 3 episodes in this thread, episode 33C1, episode 33C2, episode 36B1, we saw 3 waves of how this had evolved. Firstly, in classical antiquity, back in the 300s before our era, Plato and more lastingly his student Aristotle had laid the foundations underpinning all the basic questions I hinted at above. And then around the 11th and 12th centuries, a couple of scholars of the Islamic Golden Age, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, Averroes, had built up, or sought to, on Aristotelian foundations, in their case, of course, within the realm of Islamic theology. And then we came to where we are, in medieval Europe, where scholastics took Avicennan and Averroist ideas further, this time adapting it to their value system. I've outlined this progression in sufficient detail in the previous trilogy, but to put it extremely succinctly, by the time we get to our point in the story, there had developed, over the course of those 3 intellectual phases, an elaborate metaphysics comprising ontology, epistemology, and theology. That is to say, to explain reality, how we know, and God's place in it. This had crystallized in the idea of universals, that there are universal categories or definitions of which individuals are but instances. Think of each universal as a cast iron mold, and the instances the individual objects cast from that mold. Thus the universal of humanity, with individual men and women being cast from that mold. This is what was called realism, different from our general use of that term as pragmatism. It was just a theoretical framework for reality. And what did William of Ockham do when he saw this elaborate edifice of a chessboard game of metaphysics of realism? He smashed it to smithereens.
The sledgehammer's wedge.
Yes, his actions amount to something much more significant than a razor cut. Let's see how. Ockham quite simply said there was no such thing as universals. He argued that there were only singular particulars, the individual instances in reality, and that any attribution of a group of such particulars to a universal was essentially a figment of our imagination. These universals did not exist out there. It was only in our minds. In technical terms, Occam's ontology, the study of reality, was reduced to a study of individuals without this whole edifice of theoretical positing of trying to explain reality. This meant Plato's forms, Aristotle's essence, Avicenna's existence modality were all thrown out of the window. And fundamentally, Occam's argument was that we don't need to make up a whole bunch of theoretical stuff to explain things. Later, to be called the principle of parsimony. It's enough to go out and observe individual entities to understand reality. The phenomenon of observation, called empiricism, which Roger Bacon tried hard to advocate. I guess we can now see how the development of this argument, called nominalism, it's all just names, just labels, meant there was a need to develop a new epistemology, how do we know anything, which in the nominalist approach involved honing the method of empiricism, observation-based deduction.
The thin end.
But in doing all this, Occam wasn't trying to dismantle Christian theology. His point was that God was indeed the supreme being, but the nuance Occam introduced was whereas God had absolute power, what he actually exercised was ordained power. So, God, if he willed, could definitely make pigs fly, but in the reality we know, he's chosen not to. Note to self, insert another Bacon joke. The natural inference from this was that we cannot know reality by theorizing it, but only by observing natural phenomena around us. We cannot deduce how nature works from first principles. And I'll reiterate, Occam's intention was to uphold the supremacy of God, and thus the consequence here was, while the above approach is our course for observable phenomena, Matters of theology, i.e., God cannot be explained or understood by any form of rationalization or philosophizing, but rather by faith and Scripture alone. So yes, while he is known for the concept of Occam's razor, which, in its current form and intent, was ironically retroactively attributed to William of Ockham centuries later, not to mention misspelled, the real Occam's impact cuts far deeper. Imagine Einstein was best remembered for shaggy hair and violin instead of his theory of relativity.
A new way, a mighty sway.
So, unlike Roger Bacon's efforts in making the case for empiricism, Occam's ideas caught on like wildfire within the universities of Oxford, Paris, and beyond, leading to what came to be known as the Via Moderna. Occam's core ideas around the principle of parsimony, long before the term Occam's razor was coined, were applied in natural philosophy. We can see echoes of it in Isaac Newton centuries later saying, "We are to admit no more causes of natural things than such as are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances." One may even see an inverse implementation of the same thing by Arthur Conan Doyle when his great detective proclaims, "Once all that's not possible has been eliminated, what's left, however improbable it may seem, must be the truth." Shall we call it Holmes's razor? But, like I hinted, it was Occam's drawing a line between the need to observe things, nature here and now, and take something solely on the basis of faith, God, that changed everything. It meant empiricism could develop into modern science with all that it entails in terms of how we learn to better understand reality and thus our place in it, in terms of innovation, progress, and achievement. It also meant theology was freed from having to constantly seek rationalization, just as we saw it play out in our cat and dog story above. And let's pause to ponder a few rather razor-sharp set of ironies in the story we've covered over the course of these 4 episodes. 2 Islamic scholars obsessed themselves with Aristotle in trying to build a solid foundation for their own theology, and when they passed the baton to the Latin West, see episode 33b, they inadvertently helped medieval Latin Europe reconcile Christianity with Aristotle. 2 pious Franciscan friars hailing from Oxford. Yes, just like Roger Bacon, Occam had also joined the severely austere Franciscan order. In an earnest attempt to consolidate and corroborate Christian theology, unwittingly sowed the seeds for modern secular science. In fact, even within the Christendom, Occam's revolution had earth-shattering consequences. For a few centuries later, another pious Christian, imbued in Occam's concept of parsimony and faith is good enough for God stance, ends up, again inadvertently, hacking at the very roots of the traditional Catholic Church, Martin Luther. And neither of these did these 2 pious medieval Englishmen intend or foresee, and if they were ever to be told of this in the afterlife, would surely find it all deeply unsettling. So what are the lessons for us from all this? Perhaps that we should keep an open mind to ideologies and their proponents, so different from our own, that they might end up giving us ideas to improve our own. Perhaps we should be mindful of the principle of unintended consequences, for time and again now we have seen, as with Bacon and Occam, but in a very similar way also with Petrarch, episode 34, what was willed, what was wrought, and what came to be were wildly different. Or perhaps we should turn to gratitude. If you value individual rights, personal agency, and human sovereignty, you have Occam to thank. If you admire science, the empirical approach, the principle of direct observation, and the scientific method, without the need to cater to faith/religion, you have Occam to thank. If, equally, your personal faith in your God matters deeply to you, and you don't want to have to justify it to science or to anyone, you have Occam to thank.